Good afternoon, everybody. The last time I was officially in Brussels was on the 30th of January 2020. It was the day before we were due to leave the European Union, and I waved my flag in the Parliament. They cut the microphone off because alternative views have never been particularly welcome here. And this is my first official visit back. And I'd like to say that it's really good to be back in Brussels and that things have improved, but clearly they've actually got rather worse. What has happened over the course of the last 48 hours is simply monstrous. This is national conservatism. There are people coming on this platform over the course of these 2 days representing political parties that will top the polls in their country in the European elections of June this year. Hopefully 9 countries, but who knows, it may be more than that. We have, of course, Viktor Orban from Hungary appearing on this platform as well. And yet, I knew I wouldn't be welcome back in Brussels. And having one venue cancel, well, okay, I can live with that. But for 2 venues to cancel is absolutely outrageous. And what you may or may not know in the audience now is that this venue, which accepted this booking last night, and we give huge thanks to the Tunisian owner of this business for his courage in allowing free speech to take place. But what is happening as we speak is he is receiving phone calls from the local mayor. The police are being encouraged to come in and shut down this conference. They have even been speaking to the caterers. So the food hasn't arrived. The plates haven't arrived. Worst of all, the drinks haven't arrived. But I shouldn't make a joke of it, because they have told this Tunisian owner, who believes in free speech, that if he carries on with this conference, they'll make sure he goes out of business. His wife is being threatened. This is what we're up against. We are up against an evil ideology. We are up against the new form of communism. This is nothing less than that. And if anything ever said to me that Brexit was the right thing to do, that leaving this place, regaining our national sovereignty, even if we could have carried it out better, that recognizing that you cannot be an independent, democratic, self-governing nation state and a member of this monstrous union with its ideology behind it, today has told me, I should never forget it, we were right to leave. No question. But of course, none of this comes as much of a shock to me, because for my last few years here, I found life had become pretty intolerable. There were restaurants that wouldn't serve me. Coffee bars opposite the Parliament that wouldn't serve me a cup of coffee going into work in the morning. And even the pub, even the hack pub up by the European Commission, which should have had a sign on it saying sponsored by UKIP, given the amount of money we spent there over the years. Even the landlord of my local pub in Brussels, which we frequented, and we mixed with people who work with the European Commission, even Mr. Juncker would pop in from time to time, and I never caused a scene, never had a row. We were just, after work, going for a drink. Even the publican said to me one day, Nigel, I'm sorry, you can't come here anymore, otherwise the European Commission will put a boycott on our premises. So I know all about cancel culture. I know all about venue culture, and what may have come as a shock to many of you today, and perhaps, hopefully, to our friends in the press, doesn't surprise me at all. Because you see, when we talk about European Union, when we talk about the building of a new global superpower, when we talk about Brussels as the epicenter of the globalist project, no alternative view is allowed. No alternative view is tolerated. It's quite acceptable, of course, to say that you're skeptical, that you think perhaps integration is happening too quickly. All of that is perfectly allowed. But to question the very basis upon which all of this is done is unacceptable. I think Tony Blair summed up the European Union to me in the best way of anybody in modern times. He said that it was a project of peace. And if we go back, getting on now for 80 years, to the end of World War II, the argument that there should be a forum in which European countries should get together, the argument that the more people trade with each other, or as some would say, the higher levels of intercourse that occur between countries, but I'm not sure that always works, that leads to less likelihood of war. And it's right, isn't it? If you trade with each other, you are far less likely to go to war with each other. So we understand why the idea of a closer European body, be it a European Council or a European Economic Community, we understand why these things came into being in 1945 after two monstrous wars in the space of 30 years. But it wasn't very long, of course, before it was all hijacked. And it was there in the small print, in the Treaty of Rome, and I'll come back to those treaties in a moment. But Tony Blair said, this was a project of peace. It is now a project of power. And how right Blair was. It is a project of power. It is a project that salami slice by salami slice takes away the power of the individual nation state and hands it to those at the centre. And those really at the centre with real power are, of course, those that are not elected. Now, I used to have enormous fun with Mr. Barroso when he was Commission President, when for some reason they put me in seat number 20 in the European Parliament in Strasbourg and Brussels, with the Commission President in seat number 21. And this went on for over a decade. And I honestly think that I enjoyed my time in the European Parliament more than anybody else in the room did. They felt quite often, I think, discomforted by me. But Mr. Barroso used to say, but Nigel Farage is wrong. I was elected. I was elected by the European Parliament. Well, technically, that's true. But guess how many candidates we had to choose from? One. And this is their idea of democratic accountability. It is a big battle, but you have to recognize something. What has happened here in this epicenter of globalism is the coming together of a new unholy trinity. It is the trinity of big politics, of big business, and in particular of big banks. And having been through my own debanking crisis over the course of the last year, I can tell you they've become highly politicized too. The European Union, economically, is good for big global businesses. It builds a regulatory framework that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for small and medium-sized challengers to come up and break through in those industries. It's why if you go to Royal Waterloo Golf Club, on almost any day of the week, you will find people who work for the Commission, whose names you don't know, who have no chance of ever being fired, who will earn more than your national country's Prime Minister, with a pension deal that almost doesn't exist in the modern world, and they'll be playing golf with lobbyists. They'll be playing golf with the big banks. They'll be playing golf with the big manufacturers. Because never before has a system been designed where the big companies can effectively, through the Commission, write the rules for their own industry. This is the monstrosity that we're up against. Anyone that tells you that the European Union is about free trade, forget it. It's actually a protectionist bloc that looks after a few big corporate companies. Why else would the farcical High Representative for Foreign Affairs, European Commission Vice President Joseph Borrell, why else would he, following 350 rockets, cruise missiles and drones that were fired at the State of Israel, be on the phone the next morning to the Iranian foreign minister saying, there, that was really naughty of you, but we'll take no action whatsoever because we want to maintain the best possible diplomatic relations with Iran. Why on earth was that? Because he and this project are in hock to big business, and many of the components in those drones, and by the way, the drones that also the Russians are using in Ukraine, many of those components are manufactured by firms in, yes, you've guessed it, the European Union. The whole thing is in hock to big business. Now, I know there are many on this platform who will argue that it can be reformed from within. And I know that those parties that are charging forwards to these, I think, very exciting European elections that will take place between June the 6th and June the 9th this year. And funny, it's the first European election for 30 years in which I will not be a candidate. I mean, not that I missed the European Parliament, but I did enjoy upsetting them on the very, very big days. And there are lots of you going to do very, very well, and you'll do it, I know, on a reformist agenda. And you will, I hope, form a very big bloc in the next European Parliament. I hope you'll be able to form a legal blocking minority. And I hope you cause lots of noise and cause lots of problems and make life as difficult as you possibly can. It's got to be no more Mr. Nice Guy, folks. Because you see, I learned something nearly 20 years ago that shaped my philosophy about the EU, about globalism, and I think in the end will change your political agendas too, and it was this. Just over 20 years ago, we had a constitutional convention led by the very grand Giscard d'Estaing. And the constitution met, the convention met, and it led to an EU constitution. And Giscard stood up in a press conference up the road at the Berlaymont that day with the constitution and said, with this document, we become a global superpower. But there was a problem with the word constitution. It led to referendums. You know, those dreadful things where the great unwashed get to make decisions and not the great and the good, or the unelected European Commission. Yes, that very same process that, of course, led to us leaving the European Union, something that would never have happened if we'd had to trust our own parliament. There had to be referendums, and the French had a referendum, and they said no. And a few days later, the Dutch had a referendum on the European Constitution, and they said no by a really quite big margin. And the night of that result, I was in the European Parliament, in the press bar, and there were 50 or 60 of us having quite a jolly party. Well, you know, you've got to celebrate victories in life, folks. I mean, otherwise, what's the point of being here? And walking down the corridor, past me, was a German socialist, a humorless German socialist. They generally are, believe me. By the name of Joe Leinen. He'd been in the parliament for a couple of decades. He had been on the Constitutional Convention with Giscard, and you know, he was full on for an EU foreign policy without veto, etc., etc. And as he made his way down the corridor and saw what he must have thought were a gang of barbarians celebrating, I said, Joe, I said, come on, would you join us for a drink? I tried to do it as modestly as I possibly could. I'm not sure that went very well. And he looked me in the eye. He said, you may celebrate your little victory, but we have 50 different ways to win. At that moment of elation that I felt, that European democracy was beginning to send a message to the centre that we needed to stop this and reverse this process, made me realise then, if I hadn't before, that actually this is, of itself, an unstoppable force. It is not capable of reform or change. You can't turn the train around. You have to decide whether you stay on the train or whether you leave the train. And that moment, and then of course within a couple of weeks, they scrapped the Constitution, they rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty, they boasted that by calling it a treaty, it wouldn't need referendums, apart from one, which took place in Ireland. And guess what they said? No. But were forced to vote again. And it was that whole process of the Lisbon Treaty that changed my politics. I came here in 1999 as a young, fresh-faced businessman with a view that the United Kingdom was a square peg in a round hole. We didn't fit. Our history, our culture, our language, our relationships around the west of the world, not least of which our very close relationship with our cousins in the United States of America. So I thought, if the rest of Europe wants this, that's fine. But we should leave. After Lisbon, my view changed. After Lisbon, I now want the countries of Europe to leave this European Union, to re-establish their own self-governing nation democracies and to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other, to be good neighbours with each other, if that's ever possible with the French. But you must try. You must try. And so I became an opponent of the entire project, and that was the moment at which I started to be cancelled from the restaurants, from the bars, from the pubs. And I will say this to you. You know, I've heard speeches this morning already about democratizing the European Union. The opportunity for that came in the Constitutional Convention, because one of the biggest debates in that convention was about the community method. Now listen in, mainstream media at the back, because you've probably never covered this before, and you probably don't care. But here's the point of why this is not an undemocratic set of structures. It is an anti-democratic set of structures. Because the fact is, it is the unelected, appointed European Commission that has the sole right to propose legislation under EU law. The Parliament can amend it. The Parliament can work out in practical terms how it should be implemented. Here's the bizarre thing. It's the civil service that propose law. It's the civil service that have the power to change law, to repeal law. It's the elected bit in the Parliament that does the job in most countries that the civil service does of working out in practical terms how this can be implemented. It is called the community method, and I challenged Giscard. During that convention, I said, look, if you get rid of the community method, if you make the European Parliament, and within that Parliament, that to be the government of the new European Union, I won't agree with it, because it will still destroy national sovereignty. But you would at least have a legitimate set of institutions, provided the peoples of Europe accepted that and adopted that in their own free and fair referendums. And they didn't do it. And they will never, ever do it. They will never give away that power. And big business and big banks and all the others who now, as I've said already, control the rules for their own industry to stamp out competition to their own prominent positions will never allow it to happen. And that, folks, is why this is unreformable. That, folks, ultimately is why people have to leave. And it's got worse, because it's now backed up by a court that once again was set up with all of the best motives. You know, a European Convention on Human Rights, a court in Strasbourg, an early warning bell to try and stop the kinds of things that progressively were happening to the Jewish people in Germany and Austria in the 30s, but perhaps not being noticed around the rest of the world. Set up with the best of intentions, but now utterly and completely politicized. Difficult for any of us to change our immigration policies. Difficult for any of us to deport people who come illegally, whether it's over the English Channel or the Mediterranean Sea. And now, after the ruling in favor of this group of women from Switzerland last week, now telling us that we have no option but to implement net zero policies, even if we do it at the same time that Mr. Modi, who's up for re-election in India, is boasting that Indian coal production will break 1 billion tons this year for the first ever time. An unreformable system backed up by a court that has now become frankly illegitimate and gone way beyond its means. Now, folks, I don't expect you to go to the electorate in June this year saying it's time to leave. But what you have to do, believe me, if you ultimately want to win, if what you really believe in is the nation state, that it is the nation state to whom we pay our allegiance, it is the nation state to whom we pay our taxes, it is the nation state who we are prepared in times of great crisis to make sacrifice on behalf of. And if you believe the best way for that nation state to run is through directly accountable democracy, and by the way, you'd be right, and I'll go back to the beginning, the project of peace. There is no example in the world of two mature, functioning democracies ever going to war with each other. And that was the mistake we made after 1945. We should have fostered democracy in the nation state and cooperation, not a project that has led to central assimilation. Come back to Brussels, lots and lots of you. I'll come and visit. I'm sure Mr. Verhofstadt will welcome me back into the building. And stand up and fight for your rights. But ultimately, you must at least privately to begin with, and then publicly when the time is right, recognize there is no compromise with this ideology. There is no compromise with this new religion. And if you need a reminding of that, just think of the monstrous events of the last 48 hours and of that brave Tunisian man and his family who've in the end hosted us here at this conference, who are now being threatened by the thugs and bully boys who are part of this whole monstrous ideology. Thank you very much indeed. And good luck, all of you.